Hello, 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 and thank you for tuning into the Keto Answers podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and joining me this week is Chris Masterjohn. Chris is one of the go-to experts in the world about nutrient density, nutrient profiles, how to test for nutrients, everything basically micronutrient specific. Chris knows it, and he is the master at it. So in this episode, we go kind of in depth about what nutrients you may be missing in your diet, how to test for them, how to see signs of deficient nutrient intake, and what to do about it. So if you're learning about macronutrients of the ketogenic diet, awesome. But I think one of the biggest things that people miss out on is the focus on micronutrients. And so if that's you, tune into this episode, and I hope you learn a lot.
Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. That being said, let's get into the show. Chris, thanks for being on the show, my man.
Anthony, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
You are one of the guys that I've followed for a very long time for the reason that, your PhD is in nutritional sciences, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So you have just spent what I consider a lifetime of work just breaking down the science on different amount of nutrition that you need and how it's not very clear from kind of what we're looking at on a day-to-day basis. And so thanks for being on the show. I hope that we can dive into a lot of this stuff and clear up some confusion.
Sounds great.
So one of the biggest things that I want to just point out in the beginning is that a lot of people listening are probably interested in something like a ketogenic diet, which is great and can be very helpful for a lot of different reasons. But what the trend and what the internet says right now is ketogenic is not necessarily healthy or promoting health. Just because if you have your ketones at a certain, let's say, millimolar reading on a blood strip does not necessarily mean that you're healthy. So people can eat cheese sticks and bacon and all this stuff all day and register a ketone level, but think that they're doing something that is really healthy. It's like akin to buying, snacks and just because it says gluten-free or organic, people think it's healthy. So can we just highlight very quickly the importance of nutrition and different nutrients on your body?
Sure. Ketones are fuel. And if your ketones are rising and your glucose is dropping, that means that you're burning more fat for fuel and less glucose for fuel. That really doesn't tell you anything about your health. The human body is designed to be able to run on carbohydrate and fat for fuel. It's definitely the case that we evolved under conditions where we had plenty of carbohydrate availability. We come from equatorial regions where the plant food availability is highest. Certainly humans have always been exposed to ketones for fuel every night, because when you go 8 hours without eating, you probably make somewhere around 100 calories worth of ketones that you run on for fuel overnight. And our ancestors were always periodically exposed to greater levels of food deprivation by force of nature, because sometimes food's not available, and more extended levels of fasting would produce more ketogenesis. The ketogenic diet is, in my view, not the original diet of humans. It is it was devised as, you could think of it as a biohack of fasting physiology, where in the 1920s, medical researchers were interested in how they could treat epilepsy. They knew that fasting was effective, but you can't fast forever because you eventually die of starvation. So they said, maybe we can mimic certain aspects of fasting by designing a diet to produce those effects. And so it's scientific. It's an important part of medicine. It's been with medicine for the better part of any modern treatments have been over the last century. And it's really important. But the idea that you need to have your ketones at a certain level to be healthy is definitely not the case. And the fact, have that they are there, doesn't mean you're healthy. It just means that you're running on ketones for fuel and you're running proportionately less on glucose for fuel. Health is much, much, much broader than that. I mean, certainly, probably it is part of health to be able to be metabolically flexible. Probably the healthier you are, the better you'd be able to fast and eat, and the better you'd be able to run on fat and carbohydrate. And in fact, if you look at certain nutrients, there are nutrients that are really important to glucose metabolism, and there are nutrients that are really important to fat metabolism. So take, for example, thiamine or vitamin B1 and riboflavin or vitamin B2. These are both B vitamins, obviously, B1 and B2, and they're both involved in all aspects of energy metabolism. So you do use thiamine when you burn fat, you do use riboflavin when you burn carbohydrate, but you need about twice as much thiamine to burn carbohydrate for fuel as you do when you burn fat for fuel. By contrast, if you look at what happens in riboflavin deficiency, for reasons that aren't quite fully known yet, the way the body prioritizes the use of riboflavin is such that your fat metabolism is hurt first. So if you're moderately deficient in thiamine, you're probably going to become more and more glucose intolerant, and you're probably going to feel better running on a fat-based diet. Whereas if you're deficient in riboflavin, the exact opposite is going to be true. You're going to have difficulty on a fat-based diet. You'd have a lot more difficulty on a ketogenic diet because you're trying to utilize fat as your primary fuel, and yet that's the thing that suffers most in riboflavin deficiency. So there's a lot of certainly nutrients tie into your ability to utilize energy, and in fact, there's 7 B vitamins whose overwhelmingly central purpose is the utilization of energy. But nutrition is much more broader than that, and energy metabolism is much more broad than B vitamins. It's really a very interconnected web, such that literally everything in your body happens because of what you ate. Right. There's not one single piece of your body that is not made out of something that mostly you ate and the remainder your mother ate. Right. Literally everything. Right. So yeah,
that's one of the biggest things that I like to hit on is that you are literally the thing that you eat. Like there is no other way to make your cells and to grow as an animal, as a human. And so it's like of critical importance. When you were saying like before, it's just an energy system. This is something that I think a lot of people get lost on, because to get in a state of ketosis, you need to restrict carbohydrates. So people think about, okay, well, my macro numbers need to be this, and my carbs, protein, and fat need to be at this level. I know that people have had success with fat loss doing if it fits your macros approach. And they think like, well, I can just meet my demands by, as long as anything I can plug into MyFitnessPal will equal this amount, well, then I can get wherever I need to be. But what you're saying is that even to use certain energy states, you need certain nutrients.
Yeah, you absolutely do. I think fat loss is kind of a separate topic. I don't think that if you look at all the classical nutrient deficiencies, none of them make anyone fat. They all, if anything, make people lose weight, but they become emaciated. They don't become like looking hot naked because one of the ways that one of the things your body does when you can't effectively burn energy is it decreases your appetite, because what are you going to do with that? You need nutrients to store fat too, right? Like you need nutrients to do everything. So if you're fundamentally deficient in and there's different degrees of deficiency, right? So you can be slightly deficient in thiamine, and probably the only manifestation you might have is that your blood sugar spikes too much, whereas you could be severely deficient in thiamine and you're having seizures. So there's a big spectrum there. But when you are deficient enough in a nutrient to actually change your body weight, you are going to become emaciated because you don't have the nutrients that you need to synthesize muscle protein. So muscle protein breakdown is going to predominate over muscle protein storage. You're going to deliberately break down your tissue to find the nutrients that are there, right? Like you store nutrients in all your tissues. And so if you're starving for a nutrient, breaking down that tissue is a way to release more of that nutrient and also cut the demand down. Because if you lose your muscle tissue, you don't need to do as much stuff because it's it requires a lot of energy and metabolic activity just to keep the muscle there. And then fat, if you can't store fat, you can't you can't do anything with that energy. So the only way that your body can really economize in those situations is to decrease your appetite and make you become emaciated. Most people in your audience and my audience aren't really in that point because they're not deficient in anything to the level of severity that would cause something like that. So for most of us, nutrition is not really going to impact. When I say nutrition, I mean vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids, micronutrients. Those things are not really going to be major determinants of your success with weight loss. It's really about being healthy when you have too much weight or when you lose your weight, right? If your goal is to lose fat and get down to a certain waist size or get down to a certain body fat percentage, you don't want to do that in a way that compromises your health. You want to do that in a way that retains your health and maybe even improves your health. Right. And so you don't want itchy skin. You don't want dry, flaky skin. You don't want your hair aging, graying too fast. You don't want to feel fatigued. You don't want to feel anxious. All these things are all physiological processes that are governed by nutrients. And so it's really the quality of life that you're preserving when you're eating well, rather than the specific change in body composition.
Right. And so people, when they're hearing this stuff, might get a little overwhelmed because it is such a complex topic and there are so many different nutrients that we do need. Is it as simple as people just plugging in information into an app and saying, oh, well, this says that I'm getting 120% of my vitamin A today?
That can be part of it, but you have to realize that it's just a starting place. So if, let's say you're plugging into MyFitnessPal or Chronometer, generally Chronometer is a better choice for tracking micronutrients because there's a greater number of vitamins and minerals that are tracked. I usually I like the MyFitnessPal user interface a little bit better. So usually I recommend if people are just trying to track calories and macros, they use MyFitnessPal, and if they're trying to track vitamins and minerals, they use Chronometer. But anyway, you can do that, and I think it's an absolutely important part of assessing your nutritional status. But there are limitations to it that you really have to be cognizant of. So first of all, I mean, put aside the fact that there might be errors in the database and just assume that everything operates in the ideal world where it's giving us accurate information from the databases. First of all, if they're telling you you have X percent of the daily value, they are taking the daily value, probably the daily values provided by the FDA, which are generally pretty much based on the DRIs that are produced by the Institute of Medicine. And the main DRI that most people are familiar with, DRI is dietary reference intake. The main one that most people are familiar with is called the RDA, the recommended daily allowance. And that's calculated on the assumption that it's going to fulfill the needs of 97.5% of the population. And it's assumed in every RDA that everyone's nutritional needs are different. If you look at most RDAs, there is not enough data to characterize what that variation is. And so they just pull a number out of thin air and say, let's assume that it varies 20%. And so they set the RDA saying, well, if this is the average need, we want to protect people going up and down 20% from the average. And then we want to put a little safety window. And then we're going to assume that that meets the needs of 97.5% of the population. The point is, your needs are not the same as my needs and are not the same as the first, take the first 100 listeners who listen to this podcast and look at each person's needs. They're all going to be different. And so when you're looking at the percentage of the daily value that the app is telling you you're achieving, you don't know what your needs are. You're just looking at what is guesstimated to be the average needs of most of the people, even on the assumption that there are at least 2.5% of the population that need more. But we don't actually know that. We just know that there's X number who need more, and we don't know how many they are.
Right.
So that's the first problem. The second problem is your nutritional needs are not stable over time. Your nutritional needs vary according to the stresses that are placed on you, your emotional stress, your psychological stress, your exercise routine, whether you're in a caloric deficit or you're eating more, whether you're sleeping well, whether you've gotten sick recently. All these things can impact your nutrient needs, and so they'll change over time. And then finally, the databases that we have for food, they give us, it says like strawberries have this much vitamin C per 100 grams. Which strawberry, right? Like
right.
The numbers they're not like that. They're and oftentimes we don't even know what the sample sizes were when these were evaluated. We have no idea whether different growing conditions were used and they were taken from different regions. So we can't ignore that data, because if we ignore it, we have no idea what our diet is providing. But we have to be very cognizant of the fact that we're taking an imperfect number about what we are eating. Our strawberries might have a different amount of any nutrient, any food might. So we have an imperfect number of what we're actually eating matched to an imperfect number guesstimating what our needs are, and then taking it as a percentage. That's an excellent starting place, a very terrible place to stop when analyzing your nutritional status.
Right. And so I have a question. What are the actual parameters that the RDA is built on? So I've heard conflicting stuff, whether it's, it's at a point where people won't get sick, or it's from actual research. And I'm sure you have a clear understanding of where these are established.
So this is something that's thoroughly misunderstood throughout the entire alternative health sphere. There's a lot of people who believe that the RDA is just set at the level of the nutrient that will prevent a classical deficiency disease. So by this logic, the RDA for vitamin C is set based on preventing scurvy.
Right.
That's manifestly false. The RDA for vitamin C has nothing to do with preventing scurvy. If you read the DRI report on vitamin C, what they tried to do was find out what is the optimal intake for optimal health, and the actual metric that forms the current RDA for vitamin C is looking at neutrophil function, which is an immune system cell that helps protect you against infection, and it helps heal you when you're injured. And they looked at, in humans, if you take different doses of vitamin C, what is the maximal dose that will actually improve the health of those neutrophils, both by where does the level of vitamin C plateau, and what allows that neutrophil to function best. And that's what they used as the metric for vitamin C. Why did they use that? Because they couldn't find they couldn't find a better marker for health. And if they went back the next time they meet and do another DRI for vitamin C, they're going to have more data, and they will pick whatever is best for optimal health. So a long time ago, like many decades ago, the DRIs were set based on classical deficiency diseases because we didn't know about anything else. And then as the data progressed to say, hey, wait a second, vitamin D does this other stuff. So back in the day, the DRI for vitamin D, it's been a while since I did the historical research, but I'm pretty sure the DRI for vitamin D was originally based on preventing rickets. Why? Because we discovered vitamin D as the thing that prevents rickets. So if you were making a DRI at that time, what else would you make it on, right? But if you look at the 2010 DRI for vitamin D, it isn't. It's based on. I have to go back and read that report for sure, but I think it's based on maximal suppression of parathyroid hormone, which is something that promotes bone resorption. Whatever it is, it's based on bone health.
Right.
Not rickets is a matter of bone health, but but it's based on preventing osteopenia and osteoporosis in our day.
So that's I think that's a good point to clear up, and this is something that I wasn't really clear on either. So thanks for the little tip. So one of the things I want to touch on too is that you were saying that even so, it's a best guess, and so as you were mentioning, your body goes through different changes and may need more or less of these nutrients at different times. And so this best guess, is it just for like general average healthy people? What about, let's say, if you come down with some sort of illness, maybe you have a gut infection, if you're dealing with acute inflammation from a soft tissue injury, like these things obviously modulate nutrient demands at that point, correct?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And in the case of the DRIs, there's generally a discussion in the report about every possible contextual factor that could possibly modulate those nutrients, but they're almost never incorporated into the final number because there is just not enough data to make a specific recommendation. So there are very few DRIs that have any contextual factors beyond age, pregnancy, and lactation, but there are a tiny handful. One of them is that the RDA for vitamin C is 35 milligrams higher for smokers, based on the data that was at that time. It would probably be raised higher than that now, I think, if they did it for smokers. But a lot of these things that you're mentioning are definitely going to impact your nutrient requirements. But, if you take something like injury, it's like, well, how bad were you injured? Like, how long is your bed rest? There's just no way that we'll ever be able to be given an umbrella recommendation that fits in any kind of succinct thing, because there's too much variation in the degree of injury and the degree of recovery capacity to actually make those numbers. So
do we think that it would be a good move to have a certain set of maybe an amount of a buffer on top of even what an RDA is?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point, because is your audience familiar with Weston Price?
They should. If not, we can just give a very brief.
Briefly, Weston Price was originally a dental researcher, and he became one of the pioneers of nutritional anthropology. He traveled around the world studying traditional diets and looking at their nutrient content and how it impacted their health at a time where he really couldn't repeat. If he were alive, he would not be able to repeat this research today, because most of the groups he was doing this at the time where everyone was on the cusp of modern civilization, and so these diets were very quickly disappearing at that time. But anyway, one of the points that he made was that the people were generally consuming about 4 times the nutrient values that they needed in their most basic levels, and his argument was, you need that degree of a buffer, because if remember, people eat together too, right? Like they might give special emphasis on what foods to give to pregnant women or what foods to give to children, but they're still mostly operating as a collective unit in these societies. And so their diet has to be based around providing for the needs of the collective unit. In terms of what do they place the emphasis on hunting? What do they place the emphasis on preserving once they hunt an animal? What do they place the emphasis on foraging? And his argument was that you need to have a buffer of 3 or 4 times what the baseline amount that an adult would need, because people get sick, people get pregnant, children. Yes, they may need less of some things because their body weight is lower, but they're growing really fast. So a lot of things they need more of than adults would, and they certainly need more relative to their size, right? So like if you look at the DRI for vitamin A, for example, is not that much lower for children. If you were adjusting the adult one for body weight, and you'd get like very deficient children, for example. So if you need to kind of assume that buffer by default, because actually another point is there's a myth out there that your body doesn't store most nutrients and that it holds on to stores of fat soluble vitamins. That's not true at all. And the storage capacity of different vitamins really has nothing to do with whether they're fat soluble or water soluble. Most nutrients we can store quite a bit of. So like a molecule of folate, once it gets into your body, stays there for about 200 days. If you're eating a lot of folate in your green leafy vegetables, your legumes, your liver, for half the year, it's going to take you a lot longer to develop a deficiency if suddenly your needs increase or suddenly your dietary quality deteriorates in the latter half of the year, because your reserves are increasing. And there are some nutrients like vitamin B12, for example, you can store about 30 years worth of vitamin B12 in your body, or at least you can store enough to prevent you from drifting all the way into clinical deficiency on a very low vitamin B12 diet, a very deficient diet over time. And if you think about that, think about in B12 deficiency, there are certainly some people who are B12 deficient because they're vegetarians or vegans. Vitamin B12, which is absolutely critical to the health of your nervous system, it's needed to prevent anemia, but it's really needed for the health of your nervous system. The consequences can be mood change, like anywhere from mood changes to autonomic dysfunction, like orthostatic hypotension is an example. You stand up and your blood pressure drops, or your heart rate doesn't change to match your exercise and you become exercise intolerant. But it can also progress to severe mental problems like confusion and even psychosis. So if you look at early stage vitamin B12 deficiency, because it's mainly almost exclusively found in animal products, the rates of B12 deficiency among vegetarians and vegans are really high. Like early B12 deficiency is over 70% of vegetarians and over 90% of vegans, depending on which measure if you're looking at using sensitive measures. But if you look at the general population, because most people are not vegetarian or vegan, the main reason that most people who are B12 deficient become B12 deficient is that they develop chronic gastritis. And the overwhelming risk factor for chronic gastritis is age, because what happens is about half the population has H. pylori in their stomach, and they start developing gastritis in childhood, but it's asymptomatic, it's very low level, and it doesn't cause any problems. And then gastritis, meaning inflammation of the stomach. Then over the course of decades, the gastritis progressively gets worse and worse until the point where they reach 60 or 70 years old. Now it's bad enough that it's really severely hurting their B12 absorption. Well, if you spent your life accumulating extra reserves of B12, remember you can carry yourself through a deficient diet for 30 years if your reserves are maxed out. So if you spend the first 50 years the first 30 or 40 years of your adulthood, and you spend most of your childhood getting more B12 than you need, if your absorption tanks when you're 60 or 70, you might be fine, right? Because you might have a 30-year supply of B12. And that's really critical, because when the nervous system degeneration occurs in B12 deficiency, it can become irreversible. So if you are maintaining a buffer like that, that's like putting money in your retirement account so you don't end up in poverty when you can't work anymore. Right. It's the same thing. You will not stop being able to walk properly. You won't be confused all the time, and you definitely won't develop delirium and confusion and psychosis because you ate well when you were younger.
Yeah,
and
good things to avoid.
More than you needed to supply your health at that age when you were younger.
Right. And so I think it's safe to say that eating for a buffer is definitely a good idea. You mentioned before, one of the things, like when we measure a strawberry, we don't know, where did that strawberry come from? A lot of things that people don't know is that they make a clear distinction that, let's say, a cow eating grain is going to be less healthy than a cow who eats grass, just because the cow's kind of made of what they eat. Well, a lot of plant nutrition comes from the soil and that's where it gets a lot of that nutrition as well. And so we need to look at, I think there's a lot of things in foods that people don't realize, like transit time, storage time, when foods are picked versus when they're not, how local they are, the soil quality. Can you just go over like a brief overview of nutrition and how it relates in plant nutrition here?
Yeah. So one interesting case study would be to look at boron in the soil. So boron, maybe it's an essential nutrient for humans, not really clear. There's some evidence, for example, that boron can improve testosterone in men. But boron in the soil, you can have deficient soil boron, but you can also have deficient soil organic matter, or you can even have the pH of the soil be off, and the deficient soil organic matter or the inappropriate pH of the soil will prevent absorption of boron into the plant. Well, why do you care about that? Well, not only does the boron in the plant provide the boron for the animal, but boron is actually critical to the photosynthetic structure of the plant leaf. And the photosynthetic machinery is what carries vitamin K. It's what carries beta carotene, which becomes retinol, the physiologically essential form of vitamin A when it meets the animal. It's carrying vitamin E and other pigments to protect the photosynthetic machinery and the plant tissue from all of the light that is happening, that it's being exposed to during the photosynthetic process. So if any of those things go wrong with even just the boron supply, the photosynthetic machinery fails because the boron is so necessary to it, and all the fat-soluble vitamins and carotenoids drop. Now, one of the key basis of why grass-fed is better is because grass, particularly rapidly growing, deeply rich green grass that has very high photosynthetic capacity, is providing so much more fat-soluble vitamins. That's how, for example, liver gets its vitamin A, because of the beta carotene that was in the grass. And once, like you made a good point, which is where does that comparison start breaking down if you have high quality grain from good soil versus low quality grass from bad soil? It really starts to get murky because that soil nutrition is the basis for how even things like fat-soluble vitamins wind up getting into the animal tissue. Another example, I was just talking about B12. Well, B12 is the one vitamin that has a mineral in it. It is the scientific name is called cobalamin, and that's because cobalt is at the center of the vitamin B12 molecule. Well, there's no demonstrated need for cobalt in humans. Maybe there's some trace need, but we haven't demonstrated that. Certainly we need B12, and one of the factors that can determine whether you are getting that buffer of B12 we were just talking about is whether your animal meat actually has the B12 in it that the database says it has, and that all depends on the soil level of cobalt. So there are many examples like that. Just like you are what you eat, the things that you're eating are what they ate. And when you get down to the plant is what the soil provided, Right. So the whole food web matters for sure.
And so this is clearly a thing. I think food transportation and when food is picked is another thing that people don't realize, that one, as soon as something is plucked from the ground, it starts losing nutritional value. And then two, with having to transport plants so far, I mean, we can't pick them when they're ripe. We have to do it before they're ripe. And so how does this affect nutritional composition?
Yeah, well, what that means is you're starting from lower nutritional value because the nutritional value is highest at the point of ripeness. So you pick them before they're ripe, and they have lower they don't just have lower nutritional value, they have lower flavor profiles too. So there are definitely industrial responses to this. I'm not too familiar with the details, but there are some Silicon Valley startups that are basing their whole value proposition on providing ways to protect foods from transportation when they're picked at the point of ripeness, because even apart from the nutritional value, it's massively in the interest of the flavor value of the food too. Yeah, I mean, that just plays. That's just one more factor that plays into the variation that is going to be between the food you ate and what the nutritional database says.
So another thing that you brought up was the carotenoids in plants being precursors to things that you use in the animal form. Mm-hmm. How much of that stuff in plant nutrition really gets converted, and what are the factors that determine that?
Oh, well, there are a handful of nutrients that require metabolic conversions. One is carotenoids of vitamin A. Another is the conversion of pyridoxine, which is the plant form of vitamin B6, into pyridoxal and pyridoxamine, which is the form of B6 that you get in animal foods. And there are the conversions of the essential fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids in plant oils, into the longer forms that you would get from animal foods. In every single case, the form in the animal food is the form that humans require to be in their body to be healthy and prevent deficiency. In no case at all ever is the form in the plant the form that you actually need. And that should be kind of intuitive, right? Because humans are an animal. And so if animals are consuming the plants and metabolically converting these things into the things that animals need, then of course humans are going to be are going to also need the animal forms of those nutrients. Now, in terms of how efficient is that conversion, it's incredibly variable between individuals. And there's usually a vast array of factors that govern it. Out of the three that I mentioned, the one that is best understood is the conversion of carotenoids to retinol, which is the physiological form of vitamin A. In that case, it's dependent on, you could really write an entire page of factors that this is dependent on. So if you look at fruits and vegetables, generally the conversion on average, like if you took 20 people and you measured it all of them, the average conversion of those people would vary between 3 and 25% according to the different food. And that's because different foods have different matrices that make it easier or harder to harvest the carotenoids from that matrix. And then they also have other factors that can influence the conversion. So different fatty acids have an influence, different nutrients have an influence, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, if you have a more oily matrix, you're going to get higher absorption. So the absorption from red palm oil, which is very rich in carotenoids, is much higher than the absorption from most fruits and vegetables.
Like a carrot, among the fruits, it was one of those ones that people always claim.
Yeah, so carrot's probably going to be down closer to 3%. But there are things you can do to the food that influences it. So if you cook the food, the conversion increases. If you puree the food, the conversion increases, and that's because you're breaking down the matrix, which is the limiting factor for getting the carotenoids out. Now, then there's a lot of so that variation that I just said was about the variation between foods. Now, if you look at, let's say we had those 20 people and we fed them those different foods. Now, if you were to take the individual data from each person and compare them to each other, you're going to see enormous variation between those people. So, and some of those things you can do something about, some things you can't. So just on genetics alone, if you were to take 100 people and you were to divide the room in half so that you characterize all the people on the left and all the people on the right, if you sorted them for carotenoid efficiency, we could say the people on the left are controls. They have like the maximal carotenoid conversion. The people on the right are the people with all the genetic polymorphisms that decrease the conversion. In the people on the right, they would be at least half as good. I should state that differently. Their conversion would be cut at least in half. So they're either half as good as the people on the left or worse. If you divide that right side of the room into two again, then the people on the far right are going to be 4 times worse at converting carotenoids to retinol as the people on the left side of the room, right? So that's a very large number of people that are affected, and the effect is very large. But that's only the genetics. Then you look at factors like digestive problems, especially parasites, has been well studied, decrease the conversion. Deficiencies of other nutrients like iron, zinc, and vitamin E all decrease the conversion. The type of fat you eat makes a difference. If you eat more polyunsaturated fat, like is found in vegetable oils, that decreases the conversion. If you eat more saturated or monounsaturated fat, like in animal fats or olive oil, that increases the conversion. If you eat more total fat, that increases the conversion compared to eating less total fat. So you start getting, you're probably better off with canola oil than you are with no oil, but you're way better off if you're using olive oil or macadamia nut oil or tallow or lard or, any of the traditional fats. And then on top of all that, there's hormonal problems like hypothyroidism, for example, decreases the conversion. So there are so many things that can influence that you can be reasonably sure, you can be a lot more sure that the vitamin A measurement that the database says you're getting when you're eating animal foods is far more accurate than what it says you're getting when you're getting your vitamin A from plant foods, because the plant foods have so much variation.
And there's kind of this debate now about, still people are trying to get over the fence that animal products are not going to kill them and give them cancer immediately. Are there any real nutrients in plants that are super critical that we're not going to get from animal products? If let's say we're eating the completely nose to tail, not just muscle meat in some liver, like absolutely the true ancestral nose to tail. What are we missing there that we still need to get from plants?
I think if you're truly eating nose to tail, not if you're eating what most people do for nose to tail, right? So like the average person who says they're eating nose to tail is using bone broth and eating liver.
Right.
If you look at populations who were required by their environment to subsist on mostly animal foods, they had a lot of traditions around specific organs and glands that they would consume to get enough of key nutrients. So vitamin C is an obvious example. It's really hard to get enough vitamin C without plant foods, but you can do it by eating adrenal glands. You might be able to prevent scurvy by eating liver, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Right.
Another nutrient that I think is difficult to get on only animal foods is folate. So you definitely can get a lot of folate if you eat liver, but I don't think it's really desirable to eat liver every day. And if you're not eating liver because there's too much vitamin A in it, for example, there's probably too much copper in it to eat it every day. I think most people would be best off eating 3 to 4 ounces of liver once or twice a week. And you can probably get enough folate from, like, maybe if you had to, you'd eat liver 3 or 4 times a week if you're not eating any plant foods. And in that case, you could probably prevent like folate deficiency anemia, but you're not going to optimize your folate status like that. You really need, I think you really need greens in the diet to, if I were trying to construct a largely carnivorous ketogenic diet that was adequate in folate, what I would be doing is I would be looking up the folate to net carb ratio of low carbohydrate, low calorie, dark green vegetables. And I'd be seeing how much I need to get in my basic needs for folate. It does get more complicated because there are nutrients that can spare the need for folate. So choline is one of those. If you're eating brains and you're eating liver and you're eating egg yolks, you're getting a lot of choline. So you can get by. I just don't think that most people are going to have optimal folate status like that. And then potassium is an interesting one. I think you could get enough potassium on a very carnivorous diet if you made it pretty low in fat, because there's no potassium in fat. So you're eating a lot more flesh and a lot less fat. And if you prepared and cooked the foods in a way where they didn't lose their juices, like if you cook meat in a pan and you throw out the juice, you probably lost half of its potassium in that juice. So if you're stewing the animal products instead of roasting them, or if you're roasting them, if you're roasting the whole animal instead of roasting cuts, right? Like if the surface area that's exposed to roasting that would allow any water loss is much smaller if you roast the whole animal than if you cut up a bunch of meat and roast the pieces individually. And if you didn't eat a lot of added salt, which raises your need for potassium, then I think you could do it that way. Those are probably the biggest nutrients that I would be looking out for on a carnivorous diet. But a lot of it has to do with how you approach that carnivorous diet too.
Yeah, and like you said, having it be an actual carnivorous diet, brains, having adrenal glands, having everything, and not just liver and bone broth sometimes, I think is another thing that people think, like, how much collagen are you getting? Like, are you as an animal are pretty similar to other animals, whereas the majority, like I would say, 40 to 60% of the, depending on the person, is probably made of collagen-like materials. Like, you need to do that as well. I think a lot of people are missing out on that in a tremendous amount.
Yeah, and you're not going to get a huge amount doing bone broth. I mean, if you look at like the Inuit, for example, they ate dried fish bones as their main source of calcium.
Right,
so
ate the actual bones, not leached them in water.
Yeah, ate the bones. Yeah, ate the bones. Yeah.
So for people who are using a low carb ketogenic approach, how does that modify, like not necessarily a carnivorous approach, more so like a whole food approach, kind of like a paleo-esque type of thing? What are some things that the metabolism of having a lot of fat, like you said, potassium might be another one. Is there anything else that you can think of that people really need to be on the lookout for?
Well, I think that the first thing that I would do is beware of hyper protein restriction. So there are people out there that there's a lot of controversy in the keto world on the degree to which some people even question whether protein is anti-ketogenic, but for the most part, there's a lot of debate about the degree to which protein restriction is necessary on a ketogenic diet. And my recommendation would be that you not try to restrict protein to lower than a 0.5 gram to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. If you're overweight, you could count that as your ideal body weight instead of your current body weight.
Which is much higher than most recommendations are. Let's say like 0.8 grams per kilogram, which is, you divide your pounds by 2.2. So that's going to be way less.
Well, that's the RDA. So the RDA is I mean, I don't think there's anyone in the protein research community who thinks the RDA is adequate for protein. So so it depends what your measures are too. A lot of the protein intake is very well studied with respect to body composition, especially during weight loss right now. It's not really that well studied with respect to other measures of optimal health. But I think that body composition is a fairly good proxy because body composition is important to your health. So if you look at the RDA for protein, it's based on the amount of protein needed to maintain nitrogen balance. And what nitrogen balance means is nitrogen in versus nitrogen out. So protein is the one thing that you consume that has nitrogen in it. And then you break down protein and you lose nitrogen in your urine. And to say you're in nitrogen balance means that the nitrogen in the protein that you're eating is enough to replace the nitrogen that you're losing in your urine. If you're not doing that, you're going to be in a chronic state of muscle loss because how could you not be if you're losing more nitrogen than you're taking in? Now, that's a very questionable way to arrive at the ideal protein intake, because one thing that is not even remotely controversial is that your body tries to conserve nitrogen when your protein is deficient. So, the amount of protein, in other words, if your nitrogen utilization and turnover and breakdown is not constant, it's a function of your protein intake. So if you consume more protein, you're not like, let's say 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight is nitrogen balance. Well, if you go up to 1.6, that doesn't mean that you only needed 0.8 to maintain nitrogen balance and the rest was all excess that you're going to get rid of.
It doesn't mean your kidneys are going to explode like most people think.
Well, no, but it doesn't mean that. But it also doesn't even. So I mean, that's one aspect of it. But I'm making the point that that what you need, like your expenditure of protein is going to increase. What do you spend protein on? Well, protein isn't just supporting your muscle mass. Protein is what you use to make all of your enzymes. Mm-hmm. Protein is what you use. Protein is important to supporting detoxification and antioxidant defense. Protein is what you use to make the proteins that allow things to get in and out of your cells. Like, protein is used in all of these physiological processes, and the studies that showed nitrogen balance that were used for the RDA weren't looking at any of those things, right? So how do you conserve your nitrogen when your body sees that it's deficient in the diet? Well, you probably make a lot less of all those enzymes and receptors and hormones and all kinds of things that are made from protein. So we really need to study more where the point of like supporting some indicator of health is. But there is some research on there, such as like what is optimal for your bone health, what is optimal for your body composition, and that research is all heading in the direction of supporting closer at least 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight, which is it's approximately a half a gram per pound of body weight, which I think is, in the United States, people are going to have an easier time thinking in grams per pound. But that's not really my point about the keto diet. I'm not really thinking about the protein. I'm thinking about the other nutrients. So when people are on keto, the people who are avoiding protein for the purpose of getting higher ketone levels and are pushing their protein a lot lower than that are way more likely to become deficient in nutrients than people who are trying to hit the like 1.2 grams per kilogram or maybe a little higher than that. The reason is that fat has hardly any nutrients in it, except some fats have fat soluble vitamins in them. Most fats aren't that rich in fat soluble vitamins. So like butter is a pretty good source of fat soluble vitamins. Certainly egg yolks are predominantly fatty and they're a good source of fat soluble vitamins. But most fats, I mentioned red palm oil before. Red palm oil is very rich in carotenoids and vitamin E. But like coconut oil has like no vitamins in it. And that's like olive oil has no vitamins in it to speak of, really. There's some polyphenols in olive oil. So if your diet is overwhelmingly fat to the point where there's hardly anything else in it, then you're really freezing out the nutritional value of animal flesh and plant foods. So if you did a keto diet where you hit the protein targets that I was mentioning before from meat, that meat is it's not just protein. That meat is going to supply B vitamins. That meat is going to supply minerals. That meat will be, as long as you don't cook, like drain all the juices out when you cook it, that meat's an important source of potassium. And if you then also take whatever your limit for carbohydrates is, I mean, even if you only have 20 grams of carbs a day to spend, you can get a lot of certain green vegetables in that can be really important sources of folate, that can be really important sources of potassium, can be really important sources of vitamin C. and so on. And so my recommendation really isn't about the protein. It's about the nutritional value of those other things. Let's say that you're doing a keto approach and your goal is really to restrict protein as far down as you can because you're concerned about maximizing your ketones. My guess is you'll probably have an easier time pushing your ketone levels to the max if you do that. But you do it at the risk of losing particularly the B vitamins in the meat. So there's a case report from the 1970s where now the ketogenic diet, remember in the medical community, the ketogenic diets are pushing the ketogenesis to the extremes because they're trying to treat extreme conditions. From the very beginnings of the Mayo Clinic, they were always supplemented with vitamins and minerals because they recognized that if your diet is the sole goal that you're basing the diet on is maximizing the ketones, and in order to get there, you're restricting protein and carbohydrate both, you're not going to get all those nutrients from fat. So they always supplemented it with B vitamins. Now, ironically, in the 1970s, there were some people who were treated for epilepsy with a ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet was not supplemented with B vitamins, and it wasn't formed around the recommendations that I just gave you about vegetables and meat. And so the fat was so predominant in the diet that they became deficient in thiamine and developed optic neuritis, which can cause blindness. So it's like they traded one neurological problem for another. And the irony of this is that I told you at the beginning of the podcast that your needs for thiamine are twice as high when you burn carbs versus fat. So they're actually eating the diet that maximally spares the need for thiamine, but it doesn't make the need for thiamine zero. And if that diet doesn't have any thiamine in it, you're going to wind up with neurological problems. Just a different variation on what you were trying to fix.
Right. So clearly this is why I wanted you on the show, is that you spent so much time looking into this stuff, into the nitty-gritty details of all of these different pathways. And so you recently launched this testing nutritional status doc, where you kind of put this cheat sheet together about all the stuff. And this is something that I really want to highlight, just because when I first opened it and scrolled through it, I was like, oh my God, this is a lot of information. And then when I started digging into it, it's like, what was it, like 70, 80 pages or something like that?
78.
Yeah, there's just no fluff, and it just gets down to like
zero.
Yeah, this. Thank you so much. You could have published this as like a 500, 800 page textbook, or some book that goes on shelves that is just a bunch of useless garbage. Like, this is the most actionable PDF that I think I've ever downloaded on my computer. So thank you for taking the time to do this. But I mean, the things you touch on are incredible. It's like you go of how you can evaluate things. So if you can test it, like a comprehensive testing approach, like you have a time-saving approach, and then when we can like do it with least amount of monetary input, like a cost-saving approach, whatever nutrient you would need, signs and symptoms that you might be deficient or maybe having too much of them. Can you just break this whole thing down for people who are listening?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly this could have been a 500-page textbook, but there are 500-page textbooks that are actually really good. What there isn't is something that extracts all the actionable stuff into the most simple, succinct, actionable guide, which is exactly what I've tried to do with this. So I although it's 78 pages, the reason I call it a cheat sheet is because if you wanted to just be like, well, you know what, I just want to do a comprehensive nutritional screening. Well, all of the testing is all that you would need to do that is on one single page. And the first 5 pages are basically a complete algorithm for how to use any one of those 3 approaches you just mentioned, the comprehensive approach, the cost-saving approach, or the time-saving approach, to just basically holds you by the hand and walks you through what to do to gather the information you need, and then what to do about that information. So the bulk of the 78 pages, like something like 72 pages or something like that, is all reference material that you may or may not need to read depending on how the algorithm walks, not a literal algorithm, but the written out algorithm walks you through, I should say not an automated one, how the written out algorithm in those 5 pages walks you through what you need to read. So if you're a healthcare practitioner using this, I think you should read the whole thing, because you're going to be responsible for different people who need different parts of it. But if you're an individual trying to self-direct your own health journey, then it's really made so that you might only need to read 6 pages of it this year, but maybe next year you have to read a different 3 pages because of the way that your problems, that change over time and your challenges change over time. So basically, there's 3 legs of data that you really need. One is the lab tests, blood and urine tests, give you objective data about what is happening in your body. Your personal experience of signs and symptoms of nutritional deficiencies or imbalances, there's an index here that has, 100 and, I forgot the number. Anyway, the index has almost 200 entries in alphabetical order of all the possible things that could be wrong with your energy levels, your skin, your hair, your whatever. And you basically go through this and you collect the data on which of these do I experience. And then the dietary analysis, which is like we were talking about before, which you could do with an app like, in this case, Chronometer, because you're focusing on micronutrients. It walks you through how to do that, and that collects information about, in your diet and to some degree your lifestyle, what appears to be plausibly missing. You really want to synthesize all 3 legs of the information, because all the limitations that we were talking about for the dietary analysis before, like your needs might be different, what's actually in there might be different. There's a corresponding limitation to all the other forms of evidence. So, for example, in the blood tests, again, we set these ranges based on the average people, but it may be the case that you develop vitamin A deficiency when your vitamin A levels are towards the bottom of the range but not out of it. And someone who's only using the blood test would dismiss the normal value. But you really need to know that if your eyes are dry, or if your night vision is impaired, or if you have a problem with your circadian rhythm and falling asleep on a regular pattern, or if you get sick too often, all of these can be signs of vitamin A deficiency. And if your diet doesn't have any liver in it, it doesn't have any vitamin A supplements in it, doesn't have any cod liver oil in it, vitamin A deficiency is very plausible. If it doesn't have any eggs, if it doesn't have that much eggs and dairy, and it doesn't have that much red, orange, yellow, and green vegetables, then it's extremely plausible. And so you have to be able to fit those together, because you don't want to dismiss something on the basis that one of the things was off. You want to see where is the most agreement between the corroborating data, and that points you into the direction of then what to do. And the cheat sheet then, if everything points you to the vitamin A section, the vitamin A section tells you what to do if the evidence looks like deficiency, and then tells you how to monitor whether your approach was effective over time. And it also tells you, it gives you a list of caveats, like these things may look like vitamin A deficiency, but in some cases it might be these other things. And all of that allows you to really tackle what out of the challenges in my health that I experience right now, what is most likely nutritional in nature? If it's nutritional in nature, what is it? And once I know what it is, what do I do about it? And how do I follow that up over time? And so I really, I've gotten a lot of great feedback about this. I really do think it's the first of its kind in the degree to which it's actionable and practical. And right now, it's a PDF, or it's a Kindle, or it's iBook. And that's to allow the really easy navigation with hyperlinks. So one of the really valuable things about this is that, in the index, if it says vitamin A deficiency, all you got to do is click on vitamin A deficiency, and it brings you to the paragraph that you need to read. Just makes the experience a lot more seamless.
Yeah. So I haven't mentioned this to you, but I am actually on a carnivorous diet currently, and eating only animal products for about 6 weeks. And I am going to run every single panel you have on the comprehensive section after this.
That'd be
including
great.
the Genova and the Doctor's Data, the hair elements test,
Yep.
and everything from LabCorp. And I'm going to publish it, and I'll link to the stuff afterwards too, and say like, this is where I got the information from. And I want to see, where I'm at as far as these things. I know that some things that were a little bit like, for instance, like manganese and vitamin C and some of the stuff, I'm eating zero carbohydrates. So these things are, for instance, used in glucose metabolism. So, some of the reference ranges might be a little off, which is, maybe I'll ask you for help at that point. But
Sure.
yeah, this is something that I'm going to do probably in, so I'm at 3 weeks now. So in about 3 weeks from now, I'm going to give it a shot in order all these tests. I know you said earlier that you can store things like vitamin B12 for 30 years. Do you think that 6 weeks is long enough to even see anything, or do you think it would be, I would need to be on this for 3 years, 4 years, 30 years to notice many differences?
Yeah, well, I mean, B12 is an extreme example of what you can store. It would, I think, because you didn't collect before data, then the longer that you go, the better. I think, like the ideal thing would have been test it before, and then you could test it after 6 weeks to see the change rather than just whether anything looks off. I would say 3 months is probably the optimal time in terms of like actually making it practical versus trying to make sure that you don't have false negatives. But if you did it at 6 weeks and then you stayed on it and did it for another 6 weeks, like that would be pretty interesting too, to watch the changes over time. I mean, even B12, you're going to see differences in the B12 markers over time because you don't have to be in a clinical state of deficiency. In fact, a lot of those markers are very good at catching B12 deficiency before it really causes clinical problems. So I mean, you'll usually in most cases, I recommend that people stay on a regimen for 4 weeks before they do the testing, and that when they do the testing, they continue. Like some tests will say stop your supplements, and I disagree with that because most people who are taking supplements want to know what the state of their health is on the supplements.
Right.
So what I recommend is take the supplements right up through the period that you're allowed to eat food for. But if it says fast from midnight, then you don't take any supplements after that. And I think for somewhat like in those cases, I just want people to be certain whether the test is likely to reflect their current state. Whereas if you change your regimen up a week before, it's really unclear whether it's your current state or your past state. But in your case, if you really want to be, if you're really shooting for something rigorous that you can write a big post about and try to like get experimental data for the sake of having a really interesting story behind it, then I think 3 months would probably be the ideal time to capture that data without getting impractical about it.
Yeah, 3 months it is. Appreciate your work on that. Where can people find you otherwise?
So everything that I do can all be found on chrismasterjohnphd.com. If you have a favorite channel that you like to play around on outside of websites, you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat. In each case, I'm at Chris Masterjohn.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm great.
All right, guys, great news. If you listen to the episode and you're interested in picking up Chris's ultimate cheat sheet on nutrition and nutrients, how to test for them, what to look for, just go ahead and head to chrismasterjohnphd.com/perfectketo and use code perfectketo for $5 off. We don't get any kickbacks for this. This is not any incentive on our part. We just wanted to give that to you guys so you can learn and figure out more of your health for yourself. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.